Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. We're back to regular programming after Passover, after Easter, and after the ceasefire in the Iran war, at least for now. Our good friend Amos Harel, the defense analyst and correspondent at Haaretz, is with us today to help us make sense of the past 6 weeks and of the coming days and weeks may yet bring. I asked Amos to assess the results so far of the war from the Israeli, American, and Iranian perspectives, the prospect for a real ceasefire deal emerging out of the ongoing talks in Pakistan, what happens if it doesn't, and then we also talked about the Lebanon front and the Israeli campaign against Hezbollah. And at the very end, a really important point on how national security decisions are actually made today in Israel. Terrific conversation, as always, with Amos. Let's get into it. Hi, Amos. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Neri. Thanks for inviting me.
And a good morning, and thank you for coming, Amos. Last time you were on, you may remember, you may not, was last October, after the Gaza ceasefire, at the end of that war, which seems like a lifetime ago at this point, because it was. But I wanted you on today to talk about a different war, obviously the recent Iran war, and a different ceasefire that was reached last week between Washington and Tehran. And later on, I wanted to get your thoughts about Lebanon and a few other things. But my first question to you, Amos, and it's a complicated one, I think, for many people. So 5+ weeks of war by the U.S. and Israel, joint military campaign, really unprecedented and historic. Tens of thousands of strikes, Iranian leaders gone, Iranian military and economic assets destroyed, but the regime is still standing, still able to fire missiles, as we saw until the very last day. 440 kilos of highly enriched uranium still somewhere in Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz is still, for the most part, closed. So I know this war may not be over. This is like midterm exams, not final exams. But how should we, both people here and people not in Israel, think about this second Iran war? Did we, quote unquote, win, quote unquote?
So to begin with, and without trying to avoid your question, the answer is, first of all, it's complicated. And I think that the verdict is not out yet. It's a mixed bag, exactly as you described it. We're in the middle of something, and we still don't know how this would end. And of course, the number one problem is that some of the main actors are very hard to explain or understand regarding their motives. When it comes to President Trump, lots of surprises, lots of times where he contradicts himself. When we talk about the Iranians, what we now understand better after 5 weeks of fighting is that we don't understand them at all. I think that most Western countries suffering a similar amount of humiliation and military blows would probably have given in to pressure by now. But this is not the case. After about 100 hours of fighting in early March, there was a sense of euphoria, both in Israel and in D.C.
Right.
Israeli military planners were saying that this was going on much better than expected, and suddenly they did have high hopes that the regime would crumble and fall under the pressure. Regarding President Trump, we now know he's admitted that publicly, quite strangely, that he believed the war would take 3 days and that the Iranians would capitulate after 72 hours or so. This isn't where we are. So as I said, it's not a miserable draw yet, but it is a mixed bag. And the main contradiction here is between the absolute military superiority of the Israeli Air Force and the American Air Force over the Iranians, and the limited attack capabilities remaining with the Iranians on the one hand. But on the other hand, the absolute refusal of the current Iranian regime, it's not a new leadership the way Trump describes it, to give in under such pressure. This is not what they're willing to do. For them, the fact that they remain standing, it's victory by not being defeated, victory by survival. The fact that they're still here For some reason, that makes them quite optimistic about the outcome. And this is why they're refusing to make important concessions. We're facing apparently a second round of negotiations, another session at Islamabad Thursday. But as far as we know, the Iranians would be willing to compromise, but they're not going to give up everything that the Americans demand. And while Trump is proud as presenting himself as a master of the deal, this time he's facing an opponent he hasn't dealt with before. It's much more complicated than reaching another real estate deal in Atlantic City or New York.
And a lot more ambitious campaign than maybe in Venezuela or even the negotiations over the Gaza war.
Iran is not another Venezuela. That's one thing that I think that the president understands now.
Yes, I think we all understand that very clearly. It's not just an overnight snatch and grab. Amos, just staying on the military assessment of this recent war, even if it's maybe not over yet, or definitely not over yet in terms of a final conclusion to it. We heard this throughout the campaign, where you had the IDF especially, and also the Americans, but less frequently, but coming out and saying, okay, we hit this, and this site. We've conducted X number of sorties in the thousands, Y number of bombs. So it did seem like highly, highly successful tactical and even operational achievements, right? You know, like you said, complete air superiority. They can hit whatever they want, whenever they wanted. To your mind, now 5.5 weeks after this campaign started, did that translate into some kind of strategic achievement for the U.S. and Israel in their campaign?
I think that unfortunately this is the heart of the matter. It hasn't yet. I still hope that there will be a more positive outcome, but we're not there as we speak on Wednesday morning. Let's go back to February 28th. Amit Segal, who's probably the journalist, the Israeli journalist with the most access to Netanyahu, publishes that Saturday tweets about 3 main goals for this campaign. This is speaking from Netanyahu's mouth. That's quite clearly
from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, and the desired outcome at that time was A, regime change, B, wiping out the nuclear threat, and C, wiping out the ballistic missile threat towards Israel. Now, when we judge according to these 3 categories, then this hasn't been achieved yet. The regime is, for the time being, is still in power. It may be the successors, but they're still on the same ideological level as their predecessors. The nuclear threat hasn't changed much. The main event you mentioned earlier, those 440 kilograms of enriched uranium to 60%, this is the main danger. It's possible for Iran to, in the future, to produce 11 nuclear bombs from that stockpile, and this needs to be dealt with. And regarding missiles, again, we were too optimistic. As many of those launchers were hit, but in most cases, they were stuck on the ground and not destroyed completely. What we say now, just yesterday, CNN published new satellite photos of the Iranians trying to reuse those same launchers. And it's quite clear that the Iranians, if war resumes, the Iranians would resume launching rockets, missiles towards Israel and the Gulf states. Not the end of the world. It's not the hundreds a day that they wished they could shoot at Israel. But even if it's 10 to 15, if they're divided properly, and this is what we're very good at doing, we know how it can influence our public morale and so on. And it's an imminent danger as well. I wouldn't underestimate the danger. So what are we left with? One thing that we've seen is that because we haven't been able to reach regime change, what we're doing is state destruction or disruption. This is what you actually see. Israel is systematically wiping out capabilities, and not all of them military. So I think a lot of this has to do with long-term damage to the Iranian state, to the Iranian leadership. The question is, how much does the regime care? Does the leadership really agonize at night over the hardships suffered by the population? I'm not so sure. And then there's the question of military capabilities. How far ahead are we? It's presumably this has been quite significant. But then again, we've seen the same story with Hamas. How many times did Netanyahu promise a final decisive victory? How many times did he announce that this was more or less over? In all of these cases, what we see now is the opponents, our enemies, are still standing, whether it's Hezbollah after being defeated in 24, Hamas after supposedly being defeated in 25. They're still there. So the same is true for Iran. So the capabilities, a lot of them were hurt, but it's not enough to take away their will to fight and their ability to hurt us in some way. And of course, I keep repeating that life in Tehran is a dozen times more miserable than it is in Tel Aviv. We complain, but there's no shortage of water. People go to work, people are back in school, and so on. That's not the case in Tehran. Tehran is much worse right now.
So I thought you were going to take it somewhere slightly different, where even last June, after the first Iran war, there were assessments that we both heard. We even talked about it on this podcast because you came on right after that, not ceasefire, but end of that campaign. And Netanyahu said, we've eliminated a existential threat. It was a historic victory. It was backed up by all kinds of data points from the IDF. And even going back to, I think, nearly every round in Gaza before October 7th, you had Israeli generals get up there and say, well, we've taken them back 10, 20, 30 years, back to the Stone Age.
Yeah. Look, it's good that you mentioned that, and I hope I was doubtful and suspicious enough when we discussed that in June. But yeah, Netanyahu at that time bragged about wiping out two major existential threats to the state of Israel. And when we talked to experts at that time, I assume you had the same experience. They refused to commit to the same kind of loud rhetoric that Netanyahu was using. The truth of the matter was that there was significant damage to the leadership at that time, not as high as Khamenei, but others were hit, leaders of the IRGC, of the army, nuclear scientists, and so on. Their missile arsenal was depleted to some extent. And of course, nuclear damage to nuclear sites such as Fordo, Natanz, Isfahan. But actually, when you discuss those nuclear sites, they were hardly hit this time. The main problem remains those kilos that we mentioned.
Right. So damage was inflicted, is inflicted, and yet it remains to be seen how far back they're actually taken, how far it's degraded. And by the way, Amos, you cited CNN earlier about the missiles and Iran's vast missile arsenal. I think you were the first one to report a week or so ago, maybe 2 weeks ago now, that Iran was able to uncork or unplug all of those underground missile sites, which the entrances were bombed, so they couldn't access it, but then they were able to reopen those tunnel shafts. So again, how do you count that? Are they really out of use? Are they temporarily out of use? Not a minor point when you're counting data points.
I would also add that there's one thing that's common to all these rounds of fighting in Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, and so on. And that, I think it goes to the heart of the problem regarding Netanyahu. And that's this huge gap between military capabilities under him, led by the army, Mossad, Shin Bet, and so on, and the absolute inability to translate this to any kind of strategic agreement or any kind of new strategic situation. Of course, Netanyahu himself described this very differently. He's recently began saying that we are not only a regional superpower, but almost a world superpower. And he brags about creating security zones in Lebanon, in Syria, on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights at Mount Hermon, and in Gaza, 50% of the Gaza Strip. So this is the new reality. This is the answer that he's trying to provide to accusations that he hasn't reached strategic victories. But in reality, this is the problem. We're left in a situation in which all of those I call them tabs, like the tabs you have on your computer. All of those tabs remain open. All of these problems remain without any kind of stable solution. Of course, Israel is stronger than all of its enemies and perhaps all of its enemies combined. But this doesn't lead us, nobody's talking of peace and tranquility anymore, but this doesn't lead us to any kind of a satisfactory long-term arrangement. And part of the problem is because of his refusal to negotiate on these issues. So there's a breakthrough regarding direct negotiations with Lebanon in Washington, but this is because Trump demanded that of him. And we all know that Gaza would never have ended the way it did in last October, if Trump hadn't intervened after that Israeli strike in Qatar.
All true. The lack of, as they say here, a diplomatic finishing leg to all of these various military campaigns that have been going on now for over 2.5 years. Incapable of reaching those diplomatic agreements, and he doesn't want to, right? There's domestic politics involved.
It's both. It has to do with his legal problems, his will of survival, which is very, very strong, and his political issues. But I should remind you that for months, if not more than a year, regarding Gaza, his answer to American pressure, first from President Biden and then from President Trump, was that he couldn't reach a final deal because that would create enormous political problems, and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich would leave the government, the coalition, if he dares sign a final deal with Hamas. And in reality, all of these prisoners, our hostages came home. I think around 2,500 prisoners, Palestinians, were released, many of them murderers, and we didn't see one single demonstration from the hard right against the deal. And Smotrich and Ben-Gvir remain in government and in power. The seats are quite comfortable, and they did nothing about this. So I don't know if this was prearranged, but in reality, his explanations, the explanations he gave to Biden and Trump, appear to be false.
Yeah, he was able to end, at least for now, the war in Gaza. He's now negotiating with the Lebanese in Washington. He stopped the offensive against Iran, obviously in coordination with the Americans. I mean, he's done many things that, let's say, if Netanyahu was in opposition, there would probably be demonstrations in the streets against the government of the day.
This is, again, welcome to the Middle East. Yitzhak Rabin used to say that there are no holy dates in the Middle East. Netanyahu is very much integrated into the region. He cares nothing about dates, deadlines, and so on. He's not bothered by this at all.
Yeah. So let's get into the ceasefire talks that are currently still ongoing. And like you said, there may be a second round of talks between the U.S. and Iran in Pakistan, maybe tomorrow, Thursday. And like you said, we're recording this on Wednesday morning, Tel Aviv time. I mean, look, the fighting has been halted, paused, not ended fully. Do you think, I mean, first kind of very broad question, Amos, do you think there are prospects for the U.S. and Iran to actually get a deal to formally and officially end the war?
I'll say something and then I'll contradict myself. I think there's a zone of possible agreement there. And I think that both sides actually would prefer a deal than a continued war. The Iranians, in spite of everything that we've said, have suffered quite a lot of blows. And the regime, first and foremost, is its survival, but it would like to turn a page. And regarding Trump himself, what we see after all of those weeks is that he had many opportunities to step on the gas, to move forward with all of America's might and to strike Iran, its national infrastructure, and so on. And in all of these cases, he hesitated and he chose another way. The best example is last week, of course, or the week before that. I think it's a slightly earlier. On the one hand, he threatened the total destruction of Iranian civilization. It would be a pity, but he would do that. And on the other hand, a day later, he sent J.D. Vance to negotiations. So I think it's quite apparent that he would prefer a deal. Having said all that, the main issue for me is that the Iranians are too full of themselves right now, that they feel that by surviving, they had the upper hand, and therefore they can still present hardline demands in the negotiations. And as long as they don't understand that they can be hit even more badly, then it will be hard to squeeze concessions out of them. And this is the main issue. I think there's a possibility there, but if it doesn't, then we'll see quick escalation. And perhaps that would be needed for them to get back to the negotiation table. We'll have to see. There's a will to compromise. Perhaps it's not enough considering the gap in the positions. Although, we've heard already talking of both sides talking of the number of years with no enrichment in Iran, whether it's 20 as the Americans are demanding, or 5 years as the Iranians are suggesting. There's a middle way. My worry as an Israeli is that perhaps the agreement would not be enough, that what would be achieved would not be enough to keep Israel secure, and that Trump would lose interest. And perhaps having, if not exactly failed, having not succeeded in the region, perhaps he would actually gradually withdraw and lose interest in what's going on there. And that could be very, very problematic for us. It would be problematic on Iran, but also regarding Lebanon and Gaza. And to combine everything that we've said with the political issues, it's quite clear the elections are supposed to be held in October. It's quite clear that this either strategy or the opposite of strategy, but this result of keeping tabs open means that this is useful for Netanyahu, that as long as the fire is burning on one front or more, then he can have all the excuses in the world for what he's doing. And that would be extremely useful if we have close elections, a competition between the two sides, which is a narrow gap between the political support of opposition and coalition. And also it keeps people on their toes. It's something that he wants. The more there are discussions over what to do with Hamas in Gaza, or the holy crusade against Hezbollah in Lebanon, that would mean less talk of who's more corrupt or who's to blame for the terrible failure of October 7th. So I think it's useful for Netanyahu to keep the war going, at least on one front, and perhaps more. And if Trump does withdraw, that becomes a big issue for Israel.
It does. I want to unpack a few things. And by the way, Amos, yes, kind of endless conflict, this low-level state of emergency or even a high-level state of emergency does serve, especially a right-wing prime minister in this country, especially heading into an election.
It's also one, yeah.
And a populist, right, and a person who, we've seen it for years, if not decades. He's, he can get up there and basically say anything. Doesn't quite
persuasively,
quite persuasively to himself first and foremost, and then by extension at least to his supporters. But it's also
are you old enough to remember Seinfeld?
Yeah,
so
of
it's
course,
not a lie if you believe in it, as George Costanza has told us constantly.
Yeah, George Costanza, the George Costanza theory of Israeli politics, right? Mm-hmm. If you say something with enough conviction and repeatedly, then everyone maybe starts believing it.
1/3 of the electorate would follow, and this is the reality with Netanyahu.
It's true, and I was going to add, it's almost unfalsifiable, right? If you don't acknowledge or commit to some campaign or front or war ending, and you say, well, next month or in 3 months or next year, we're going to continue the war, and this time really bring total victory, then, well, why wouldn't I vote for that person? He's still promising decisive victory, not total victory anymore.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals initiative, IPF at Teed, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
I wanted to unpack a few things. So you mentioned the Iranians very full of themselves, obviously they think they've, if not won, then they've definitely not lost in their minds. But Trump is also, at least publicly, maintaining a very maximalist line, where he's saying no nuclear weapons, reopen the strait. There were reports even that he himself didn't like this idea of a 20-year window for Iran to not enrich uranium. So going back to, I think, the third point you made, I mean, is there a risk here that Trump either maintains a very maximalist demand and then you can't get a deal, or is there a chance Trump actually blinks, which is very concerning to people here in Israel?
Look, it's hard to tell, and one thing we've learned is that you should never gamble on what Trump would do. He keeps contradicting himself. He's all over the place, Truth Social and so on. I've heard a podcast where it was discussed that mostly his the way he tweets late at night and early in the morning, these are the important statements. It's him and his laptop, or him and his iPhone, and that's it. And then you know what he actually feels. But it's hard to say right now. I don't pretend to have a deep understanding of the man. I'm following him with a lot of interest from far away for quite some time. My guess would be that he's not happy, that this is going on for too long, that it became too complicated and too costly. This isn't the way he imagined it to himself after Venezuela. We've mentioned he thought it would take 3 days. He was looking for a remarkable, perhaps a parade in New York or Washington, a remarkable victory, something that would help him portray himself to the public as a wartime president, the guy who never fought in Vietnam, of course, although he was the right age. And it's not going on that well. It's the Iranians. I wouldn't overestimate their capabilities. I think they're disappointed with themselves regarding the level of harm that they've managed to cause here. And yet they're quite an impressive enemy. They're not, maybe it's not 3-dimensional chess, but they're playing a hardball, and they're willing to fight. And this is not the way he imagined it. So is there more of a chance of him losing interest, declaring victory, and getting out? I would suspect yes, that at one point or another he will either reach a compromise or just disassociate himself from the events here in the region and I don't know, concentrate on Greenland or on China or whatever. For the time being, we saw that in spite of the economic damage around the world, in spite of the emerging energy crisis, he's sticking to his guns, perhaps because it's hard for him to withdraw under these circumstances. It's right. Against his image as a tough guy and so on. But are the Iranians more willing to fight than he is? I suspect there's a possibility. I'd say this very, very carefully. There's a possibility that this is the reality.
Yeah, and again, he's maybe stayed in this longer than people expected, but also if he cuts and runs, that doesn't match his projection of strength, at least in his own mind. Amos, the second point you mentioned, the potential for the talks to actually break down and at least some level of fighting resuming. So we saw Trump declare a naval blockade, I think 2 days ago now, which has been, according to CENTCOM, implemented. There is a potential for further escalation, I imagine, if the talks break down. How do you see that happening? In other words, what is a scenario that you imagine from a military point of view where if diplomacy does not move forward, what could we be looking at? And I'm sure you get this question every hour of every day. Are missiles going to start flying again at Israel?
So I'd say something that goes perhaps against what you've heard in recent days. I think the main event is Islamabad and not so much the Gulf. What you see in the Gulf is a sort of a double blockade. There's the Iranian blockade of closing the Hormuz Strait and perhaps demanding tolls and so on. But it has been effective to an extent, but it hasn't changed everything. And on the other hand, you have the American response, because the last round of negotiations in Islamabad ended with failure. Trump needed to do something. He was not close yet to the end of his ultimatum, but he needed to project power, and this is why he blocked exit from the Gulf for the Iranians themselves, so a little bit south of the Hormuz Strait. So this is important. But as we speak on Wednesday morning, and this is about, I think, 30 or 36 hours after this has been implemented, we haven't seen massive friction. The Iranians are, of course, capable of launching missiles towards those ships or trying to send explosives. They haven't done that yet. So both sides are a bit cautious. It hurts the shipping, but it didn't blow up yet. I could be wrong on this, and it could change in a few hours, but this is the reality. So I think the decisions would actually be made in Islamabad and Washington and Tehran. It's what's going on in those negotiations, if they indeed resume tomorrow on Thursday, which would decide the course of events in the next weeks or so. But I think that if it fails there, then Trump wouldn't have lots of options, and that he would have to escalate under these circumstances. And that's the issue. Whether this next round of talks succeeds and then the blockade would be eased, or if they can't reach an agreement and there are no signs of progress, then maybe the president would have to escalate, to go to the next round. But it has, for the time being, it has less to do with what's actually going on in the field, so to speak, or at sea.
Right. The military maneuvers and potential actions as an extension of the politics and diplomacy in the various capitals. Final question, Amos, just a follow-up. I mean, in terms of escalation options for the U.S. and I imagine also Israel, what more can be done short of, Trump has already threatened power plants, bridges, civilization?
There are other possibilities there. He could hit infrastructure, and he's already threatened that. He could do something to actually move through the Hormuz Straits, which would mean massive friction, such as we haven't seen yet, neither on ground or at sea. That could also mean some kind of use of the marine forces that is already deployed to the area. I doubt whether this would mean a real ground military commitment. I suspect, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I suspect that this is too much for the American voters, and that it wouldn't escalate in that direction. But anything short of this is entirely possible. Regarding Israel, Netanyahu does not hide his intention for this to happen. He may be not as influential as he was before. We now know from the New York Times story that it was Netanyahu who persuaded Trump on February 11th that they should go for a joint campaign against the Iranians, and it was against the advice of most of the people around Trump. Netanyahu was able to convince him. He promised him quite a lot of things that didn't materialize, such as regime change and so on. I think he has limited. Never underestimate Netanyahu's influence on Trump. We've seen that work before. And yet, I think that at this moment, he has a more limited influence than he had before. This is about Trump's interests and not Israel's interests. Israel has to play second fiddle to what the Americans decide to do.
And yes, in fairness, even the New York Times article laying out Netanyahu's influence on Trump made it clear that Trump agreed with those assessments, wanted to do this, as he calls it, little journey to Iran. So it wasn't entirely kind of Netanyahu and Israel pushing Trump into this campaign. We have to kind of be fair on that front. But Netanyahu and Israel's influence, especially on this last ceasefire in Iran, definitely was not there. They were not consulted ahead of time. They were told after it was a fait accompli. So they're following Trump's lead in terms of the diplomacy. Amos, I wanted to definitely touch on what was a secondary front in this overall campaign, which was Lebanon. It was definitely not a secondary front for all of northern Israel, which is still, as we speak, getting hit by Hezbollah rockets and drones. But even Eyal Zamir, the IDF chief of staff, has now said, at least for the military, that Lebanon is now their primary focus. Big picture, can you explain to me and to our viewers and listeners what Israel is trying to actually accomplish in Lebanon? What's the objective and strategy that they're trying to implement on the ground? Because we have heard over the past, 6 weeks now, different things from different Israeli officials with regard to what they're trying to do.
So we'll have to rewind a little to the beginning of this war. October 7th, immediately after the Hamas attack on the Gaza envelope communities, Hezbollah hesitates. Hamas asks Hezbollah and Iran to join. They don't exactly join. Hezbollah starts shooting at Israel on October 8th, but it doesn't go all the way. It's not committed to the cause to that extent. Later, by the summer of 24, things escalate along the border, and Israel manages more or less to defeat Hezbollah, this is at least what we thought, by November 24. A ceasefire is reached after the pager attack, after Nasrallah, the leader, Hezbollah's leader, and other commanders are assassinated by Israel. It's quite a victory. Yet, having said that, actually fighting continued. It was Israel that struck Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon and sometimes at the Bekaa Valley and even Beirut since November and up to February 26. There were more than 400...
During the ostensible ceasefire.
Yeah. There were more than 400 Hezbollah operatives who were killed during that period. And yet Hezbollah sat tight and didn't do anything until Israel assassinated Khamenei, the number one persona in the Shiite world, a religious leader as well. Hezbollah reacted by launching a few rockets to the northern border. For Israel, that was enough. Israeli generals said that Hezbollah actually walked itself into a trap, and then Israel retaliated with all its might. And what we have, fast forward 5 weeks later, is an ongoing problem, maybe the beginning of a quagmire. Because Israel is now saying that it will need a security zone, that perhaps it would maintain control of outposts that are about 8 to 10 kilometers north of the border. But in spite of the ceasefire in Iran, no such ceasefire or agreement was reached in Lebanon. And fighting goes on. Last week, the day after the ceasefire in Iran, there was a very heavy Israeli bombing all over the place, mostly in Sunni population centers around Lebanon. More than 350 people killed, according to Lebanese health authorities. 2/3 of them, more or less, Hezbollah personnel. And yet this was devastating. And what we have now are, of course, negotiations going on in Washington. So what actually happened? Trump allowed Netanyahu some leeway. Netanyahu needed, again, a place where he could continue fighting as the war stopped in Iran. And this is why he struck Hezbollah. He has a problem there with the residents of the Upper Galilee and the Western Galilee. He's promised them so many times that this is over with. And yet Hezbollah is capable of launching around 100 missiles and rockets and drones a day, and life is not safe near the border. So for him, for Netanyahu, it's important to continue this war. The problem, as usual, is that in spite of the fact that we've killed many Hezbollah personnel, according to the chief of staff, more than 1,000 were killed. And in fact, in spite of the fact that there's heavy destruction all over the place in Lebanon, this hasn't persuaded Hezbollah to give up. Hezbollah continues to fight, and it's refusing to accept an agreement. The negotiations are going on with the Lebanese government, not with Hezbollah. So this is where we are, a continued fight, no end in sight. Israel has the upper hand. That's very, very clear. Our casualties are quite limited. I think it's around 13 killed since the beginning of the war on the north, only 1 or 2 civilians, most of them soldiers. Right. And yet, again, how to translate this into a strategic agreement and a victory, that remains a mystery. And the army itself seems a little bit lost there. I think that they're not really sure what their goals are or what they could achieve. What we're doing is hitting Lebanon, I wouldn't say blindly, but with massive force, but without reaching final decisive results.
There's a pattern here, which we've been talking about now since for over 30 minutes. Just in terms of the Lebanon,
2 years, yeah.
Right, over 2.5 years, actually. just in terms of their concrete goals and strategy, I mean, the one thing that seems very clear, because we hear it from Netanyahu, and then in different terminology by IDF officers as well, is that a new security zone, buffer zone, forward defensive line will actually be established in southern Lebanon. As somebody who covered this for years, the old security zone in the 80s and 90s, I mean, should we be worried? Is there a strategic rationale to actually reestablish this thing?
I'm worried. Look, there are no easy solutions here. If there were, we would have tried them already. And yet the security zone in the 90s was not a success. And there was a reason why the Israeli public wanted out at that time. And it was not because of progressive beliefs. It was not because of the Oslo Accords. It was not because the army or the society were weak. It didn't serve its purpose. In the end, it was not a problem for Hezbollah to shoot rockets over the heads of the soldiers in southern Lebanon and hit targets inside Israel. And the same is true right now. It's true that some of these rockets hit southern Lebanon and the army units, and yet every day rockets are launched from north of the Litani River and hitting Israeli targets. So I think that people are looking for solutions which are much too simple, and this is a basic issue. Another thing that worries me is this obsession with symbols. We're in the Middle East, we're fighting against jihadists and so on. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we need to teach them a lesson, and we need for this to be symbolic. I just read a headline at the Yediot Achronot today suggesting that victory would be achieved through the town of Binjbeil, and that the chief of staff should give a speech at Binjbeil. Why Binjbeil? Because in 2000, this is the site of the Hezbollah's famous victory, of Nasrallah's speech about where he compared the Israeli society in May 2000, a day after the Israeli withdrawal, which was unilateral and unconditional. He gave a speech in which he compared the Israeli society to a cobweb, a spider's web, saying that Israel was too weak and all the Arabs should do is learn from Hezbollah's lessons, and the way to defeat Israel was by force and fighting them on the battlefield. And I don't know if I have to remind you this, but in 2006, during Lebanon II, the next Lebanon war, Israeli army fought a senseless battle in Binjbeil. Soldiers were killed actually trying to get themselves photos with an Israeli flag in Binjbeil. And Amir Peretz, who at the time seemed to be the worst defense minister, since then we've learned that it could be worse, actually had plans to give a speech at Binjbeil, at the site of the former headquarters of the Israeli Western Brigade in southern Lebanon. So 20 years later, we haven't learned anything. We're repeating our mistakes. And every day, soldiers are being injured now in Binjbeil, and there are reports of a pocket of resistance there, and a small enclave where Hezbollah fighters are still holding, and will defeat them soon. And of course, life in the Middle East will change completely. You will feel this at your home, Neri. Once we defeat Hezbollah once and for all, everything would be changed. So that kind of talk scares me, especially because we don't learn from history. We refuse to learn anything. It's not as if I have alternative solutions, but I'm pretty convinced that a speech in Binjbeil wouldn't change anything.
And you're being a bit modest, Amos. You and our good friend Avi Zakharov wrote a whole book about the Second Lebanon War, and Binjbeil featured prominently.
I'm busy fiasco. Promoting my next book by now, so I'm not focused on that.
I mean, I will not name names, but you and Avi's book is being read as we speak. Not in Israel.
Look, there are some good stories about that. Once a colleague sent me a copy of our book from a bookstore, a photograph of a copy from a window in a bookstore in Binjbeil. It's actually here. It's actually here at my study. It has a picture of Khamenei and Khomeini, and our book at the window. So we've had that experience in the past. And actually, during the war, every now and then I would get an email from a miluimnik, from a reservist, saying that they were reading the book and how much history did repeat itself. So yeah, we're in sort of a time loop for quite some time.
Oof. Yeah, the first anecdote I really liked. The second one, less so. That reservists that are now fighting in southern Lebanon are reading a book about the war 2 decades ago. Just wrapping up the Lebanon issue, Amos. I mean, any hope that these talks, albeit low level and initial, in Washington that started yesterday, will lead to some kind of breakthrough?
I think there's hope. I think the Americans want this over. It's pretty clear after the bombing that Trump told Netanyahu to restrain himself. And what we see in recent days are skirmishes in southern Lebanon, but less Israeli bombings in Beirut or in Bekaa Valley. I think Trump wants, if indeed Iran ends, the war in Iran ends, then the war in Lebanon would end as well. The problem would be how to get a secure agreement, something that would promise us that we'd be safer on the Lebanon front. But there's also a lesson. In 24, I felt that the army was victorious. It did a very good job at that time. And yet our hopes were probably too high. I think that we were too optimistic about the outcome, and we didn't fully grasp their willingness to fight in spite of the damages inflicted, in spite of the casualties. I keep being reminded, I think Avi uses that example a lot, but you remember Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
And that knight who keeps fighting after his hands and legs are cut off and so on. Come back, you cowards, come back and fight. This is the way Hezbollah is quite willing to engage in spite of this massive destruction all over Lebanon and to its own villages, headquarters, military sites, and so on. It is willing to fight. We'll have to see how this plays out between Beirut and Tehran, what Tehran wants Hezbollah to do in the long run. Tehran still sees Hezbollah as a proxy force that needs to be protected and perhaps kept for the next round. So we'll have to see how this plays out. I haven't lost hope that some kind of an agreement would be reached. I would yet warn of one possible consequence, and we've already seen Hezbollah threatening, and that's the lives of the Lebanese president and military chief of staff and so on. Hezbollah has used such methods in the past. We've seen the Hariri assassination. I wouldn't rule it out completely as a possible outcome.
Yeah, they've I think become more emboldened than they have been definitely over the past year in recent weeks, because they have been putting up a fight against the IDF.
That's true.
So they've maybe refound both their military and political footing, but hopefully it doesn't come to it in Lebanon. Final question for you, Amos, and it probably sums up maybe a lot of the topics that we were talking about with regard to Iran, Lebanon. And it's an issue that you've touched on in recent columns of yours, but I don't think is really well understood outside of Israel. And that's the lack of coherent decision-making at the very top of the national security and defense establishment here. I think one explanation is as you've laid out, is the lack of appointments to senior posts like the National Security Council and the Prime Minister's office, or at the top levels of the defense ministry. And also, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way Netanyahu has politicized or corrupted other bodies in the defense establishment, like the Shin Bet, the defense minister himself, maybe even soon the Mossad with this new appointment. So could you explain to people, especially outside of Israel, why this issue is so important and how decisions are actually made on these very, very fateful issues of security and defense? Because to my mind, it just seems like Netanyahu is at the top with no real pushback, deciding alone.
There's no bottom under it. Look, it's a combination of two trends. One is Netanyahu attempting to corrupt everything around him. It's a battle of survival, and it's about survival by any means necessary by now, because in his view, I don't think he's right about that, but in his view, not only is there a possibility of him losing in his trial, but there's a vivid possibility of him ending his life in jail. And that needed to be avoided by any means necessary. And a lot of his calculations during those years, I think a lot of what led to the disaster on October 7th has to do with that, with his insistence on staying in power. But what he does is by now corrupt the people around him. We see his legal campaigns, his campaigns against the legal system, but also his attempts to find more and more people who would only say yes, sir, to everything he says, the way Trump wants it to happen in the United States as well. And this is what he does in Shin Bet. This is what he already did in the police. We see signs that this might happen in Mossad as well. And the army is affected as well. General Zamir was an appointment suggested by Defense Minister Katz. He probably regrets it by now. But Zamir himself, he's fighting. It's not exactly a losing battle, but he keeps withdrawing and still fighting. And he keeps telling people around him that he needs to pick his battles. He can't fight all the time against everybody. But what we see is gradual withdrawal regarding all kinds of military positions, regarding moral issues, and so on. So this is one issue. The second issue is, and we've alluded to that before, the lack of strategy. Netanyahu is a guy who doesn't appreciate strategy. He keeps quoting, when he talks to the generals, he quotes his father, the famous historian, who never believed in strategy, who felt that leaders did not do strategy, but had other motivations, whether ideological or interest or so on. But Netanyahu despises the word strategy. One American general told his counterparts in Israel, when he left, he said that he understands there's no Hebrew word for strategy. This is the way the Americans perceive us. So this is where we are. So it's not only the fact that a lot of people have left, have been fired, resigned. Think of Tzachi Hanegbi, the national security advisor, fired by Netanyahu, forced to leave on October after they had disagreements over the hostage deal. He hasn't been replaced yet. Others, and to other important positions, he's actually appointing people who would only say yes to everything he demands. So the combination of corruption, of changes in military and security leadership, and of the general mood around the country, and his legal and personal problems, all of these together create a very troubling situation, which I think affects the way we achieve our goals on the battlefront, because this is not discussed properly, and because there are not enough people to tell him no. An example for that, I think, would be what we've heard from the New York Times regarding the regime change. How many people in Israel believed that would be possible? Did Netanyahu force his position on the professional level, and so on? There's a lot that we don't know yet, but I think the signs are there. I think that we were already seeing deterioration. And a good example of that is what happened this week with head of Shin Bet, Zini, who actually gave Netanyahu a statement which warned against Netanyahu against Netanyahu appearing at the Tel Aviv District Court because the Iranians could hit him there. At the same time, Netanyahu is on all of these ceremonies for Independence Day, Memorial Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and so on, while he claims that he cannot be at a single place which is known in advance because the Iranians could hit him. Well, apparently the Iranians could hit him deep underground in the district court in Tel Aviv, but not at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, when he's out in the open at an hour in which everybody in the region knows the ceremony is held every year. That's part of our new reality.
Right. Appointing people very close to him or aligned with him.
You get what you invested in. The return of your investment. Zini is a very good example of that.
Right. And hovering over all of it is a security cabinet of his government.
Non-existent,
rubber stamp. So in the past in Israel, you've had very contentious security cabinets with diversity of opinion. But that's good. It's a good summation. It's something that is not really well understood outside of Israel, but something that you've definitely highlighted in your columns, Amos. Hoping for, better days, I suppose. Speaking of something positive, Amos, how is the book coming along?
The Hebrew version is finished. Should be out in a month, slightly over a month. But the problem, of course, is how do you end the book about a war that keeps on going? I think it's is it Al Pacino at the Godfather saying that each time he wants out, you guys
pull me back in.
Pull me back in.
Godfather 3.
I can never remember if it's Scarface or the Godfather, but this is the way I feel about this. I want an end to the story, perhaps not with a positive note, but just an end to the book. And I keep adding more pages, but at least the Hebrew version should be out by June. I hope we'll stick to the deadline. And regarding the English version, that would take a while.
Okay, so we'll look out for that. Hopefully this summer. Talks in Islamabad notwithstanding. Amos, thank you as always for the time.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Okay, thanks again to Amos Harel for his generous time and insights. Also, special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, our editor, Tracy Levy, and our assistant producer, Eden Jesselson, as always, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum so it can keep being a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening, and please subscribe and spread the word.